"Sir, step away from the gate immediately." That was the first thing the officer said before I even opened my mouth. His boots crunched against the gravel, one hand already near his holster, the other waving toward the no parking sign that wasn't even on my land. Behind him, 3 HOA board members stood in a neat little row like self-appointed soldiers, arms crossed, faces smug. I almost laughed. Not out of disrespect, out of the absurdity, because they had no idea what they were walking into. 30 seconds earlier, I'd been unlocking the rusted service gate to the lake reserve I'd just bought at auction. A forgotten patch of land at the far edge of High Pines Estates. To them, it looked like an overgrown strip of weeds and mud that ruined the view from their perfectly manicured backyards. To me, it was something entirely different. A deed tied to water rights dating back before the HOA even existed. Now here they were, shouting about trespassing on what they believed was their private lake access. The woman leading the pack was impossible to miss. Name tag, Heather Crane, HOA president. Mid-50s, platinum hair, diamond tennis bracelet flashing in the sun. The kind of woman who speaks in clipped, rehearsed tones, like every sentence has already been approved by legal counsel. "Sir, this area is restricted community property. You can't just walk onto my land?" I cut in. She blinked, once, twice, then smiled, all teeth and condescension. "This is our lake access. You're on HOA grounds." That's when I pulled the deed from my jacket pocket and unfolded it like a magician revealing his final card. The county seal caught the sunlight just right. "Actually," I said, tapping the survey lines, "you're standing on mine." Her smile faltered, but she didn't back down. She turned to the cop like a queen addressing her knight. "Officer, he's been warned before." "Please remove him from the premises." The cop looked uncertain. He studied my paperwork, then her, then the group of homeowners recording everything from their decks with cell phones. I could see him doing the math. Angry rich residents versus one middle-aged guy in work boots holding a manila envelope. "Sir," he said finally, "why don't you explain what this is all about?" So I did. 3 months earlier, I was Daniel Reeves, 49 years old, recently divorced, ex-civil engineer from Nevada trying to figure out what to do with the next chapter of my life. I'd spent years designing water systems for other people, developers, cities, golf resorts. Never once thought I'd own a drop of anything myself. Then my father passed. The man was a walking contradiction, half dreamer, half survivalist. He left behind a small inheritance and a cryptic note that said, "Look into Lot 47 by the lake. It's time someone reclaimed what's ours." Lot 47. I didn't even know what that was until I dug into county archives. Turned out to be a parcel known as Lake Reserve Tract B, 3 acres of brushland attached to something called Historical Water Access Easement, 1892. Most people would have ignored it. But as an engineer, I recognized the phrasing immediately. Easement meant utility, and 1892 meant it was older than almost every zoning regulation on record. So I drove up to High Pines to see it myself. The drive felt like moving between worlds. 10 miles of twisting mountain road led to a valley dotted with glass and stone mansions. Perfect lawns, electric golf carts, and designer dogs. And then, beyond a chain-link gate, my parcel, quiet, raw. Untouched earth sloping gently into the lake. The real estate agent didn't know much. Just that the HOA had been trying to acquire it for years but couldn't clear the title. The county finally put it up for public auction. Starting bid, $95,000. I bought it for $103,000. At first, it just felt like a retirement hobby, somewhere to fish and breathe without HOA regulations about fence colors and mailbox heights. But when I took the deed home and ran it through a legal mapping database, I froze. The reserve wasn't just shoreline. It included something else. The only legally recognized access point to the lake's underground water inlet system, which meant, by law, I didn't just own land by the lake. I owned the entry point that controlled water access for the entire community. The first knock on my cabin door came 2 days after I moved, in Heather Crane again, this time with a clipboard, and a polite smile sharpened like a blade. "Welcome to High Pines," she said without meaning it. "We just need to go over a few compliance items." She listed off things like shoreline erosion, vegetation height, and non-permitted access structures, none of which existed. It wasn't about compliance. It was about control. You see, she said sweetly, lake property is governed by HOA environmental stewardship policies. You'll need to submit an application to use this area. I pointed to the private property sign I'd already installed. I don't need to apply to use what I own. Her smile didn't fade, but her eyes did something cold, like shutters closing in a storm. We'll see what the board says. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I'd received 6 letters from the HOA, each escalating in tone, each more desperate to assert authority they didn't have. Today was their breaking point. Heather turned back to the officer. This man is obstructing community lake maintenance. We have jurisdiction here. The cop scratched his chin. You said you have the deed, right, sir? Certified and recorded, I said, handing him the envelope. Check the parcel ID against county records. He stepped aside, radioed dispatch, and waited. The homeowners whispered among themselves, shooting daggers my way like I'd defiled sacred ground. Heather stood perfectly still, jaw tight, manicured fingers twitching against her clipboard. 2 minutes later, dispatch came back. Confirmed. Parcel 47B is private property owned solely by Daniel Reeves. No HOA jurisdiction. The silence that followed could have frozen the entire lake. Heather tried to recover. Well, we'll be reviewing this with our attorneys. You do that, I said, locking the gate behind me. But next time, call before sending the cops to my shoreline. I walked away slowly, resisting the urge to look back. The sound of her frustration was better than applause. But later that night, sitting in my cabin with a cold beer and the deed spread across the table, I noticed something new. A handwritten note in faint pencil on the back of one of the old maps. Likely from decades ago. Control the inlet, control the lake. I didn't know it then. But that note would end up defining everything that came next, because Heather wasn't done. And I was about to find out just how far an HOA will go when their $1 million private lake depends on water that doesn't belong to them. A week after that confrontation, I thought things had cooled down. The HOA letters stopped. The patrol cars stopped cruising past my gate. Even Heather disappeared from sight, but peace in High Pines is never quiet. It's tactical. It started small. A contractor truck parked near my boundary line. Unmarked, no visible ID. The men in neon vests pretended to be surveying soil conditions, but I knew better. Engineers recognize engineers. They weren't checking soil. They were measuring depth. Depth means water flow. I watched from my porch, camera in hand, recording everything. They left after 20 minutes, never stepping directly on my land, but close enough to make their point. That night, I drove into town and asked around. Turns out the HOA had been lobbying the county for months to build a community access pier expansion. Their problem? The expansion required connecting through my parcel's shoreline, the same inlet my deed now controlled. In plain English, no permission from me, no project. They had millions in reserve funds tied to that pier contract, and I had the key that kept the lake flowing, and their project frozen. The next morning, I found the first sign of sabotage. My private property sign was gone, pulled clean off the post. In its place, someone had planted a small HOA maintenance area notice, complete with their official logo. It wasn't vandalism. It was psychological warfare. That evening, I drove to Heather's cul-de-sac. Her house sat at the top of the ridge. White stucco, glass balcony, lake view worth 7 figures. She opened the door before I could even knock. Mr. Reeves, she said, tone sharp but polite. If this is about that little sign, I can assure you the board had nothing to do with it. You have contractors staking my boundary and now fake signage. Don't treat me like an idiot, her eyes didn't flinch. We're trying to maintain the community's visual harmony. Your property has a certain ruggedness that's drawing attention. Ruggedness? I said. You mean authenticity? She tilted her head. Let's not make this adversarial. You're sitting on land that could serve everyone. You could be compensated for easement rights, very generously. I crossed my arms. You're offering to buy access to something you claim isn't mine. A pause, a flicker. Her mask slipped just a little. I'm offering you a chance to avoid conflict. There it was. The threat disguised as diplomacy. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Conflict's already here. I left before she could respond. but I could feel her gaze follow me down the driveway, like she was already planning the next move. Over the next few days, I kept a record of everything: photos, timestamps, even drone footage of the inlet. The more I studied the old documents, the clearer it became. The HOA's entire water filtration and irrigation system ran through infrastructure that connected under my parcel. The original builders had cut corners decades ago, routing the pipe beneath the reserve land instead of through HOA-owned property. Legally, they'd been trespassing for years, and Heather knew it. The next escalation came fast. At 3 a.m., my motion sensor lights triggered. I looked out the window and saw two silhouettes crouched near the fence line. One held a flashlight, the other a shovel. By the time I grabbed my rifle and stepped onto the porch, they were gone, tires spinning in the distance. They dug just enough to expose the top of an old maintenance valve connected to the inlet line. They weren't after my land anymore. They were trying to control the water beneath it. The next morning, I drove to the county office and filed an injunction. It wasn't about money anymore, it was about protection. I hired a surveyor to mark the boundaries with GPS coordinates and had a local attorney, a guy named Mark Holden, draft a cease and desist letter addressed directly to the HOA board. Heather didn't show up at the next meeting. But two new faces did. Both men in suits, both pretending to be consultants. They tried to spin legal jargon about community access variances and shared resource governance. I let them talk. Then I dropped the bombshell. Gentlemen, the inlet you're discussing was built illegally through private land. You're not getting access. In fact, you owe me for the years you've been using it without consent. The silence in that room was glorious. You could almost hear Heather's composure cracking from across the lake. That night, Mark called me. You realize what you just did, he said. You opened the door to a full audit. If the HOA's been billing residents for lake maintenance based on illegal infrastructure, that's fraud. He was right. And once residents learned the truth, Heather's empire would crumble. But she wasn't the type to go quietly. 2 days later, my mailbox was gone. Then my power line was cut. Then a citation appeared on my gate, signed by the HOA for unauthorized utilities usage, except it wasn't utilities. It was revenge. By the fourth night, I started sleeping with my phone recording audio just in case. Around midnight, I caught something. Voices near the shore, the sound of metal tools, and a splash like someone dropping a pipe into the water. The next morning, the lake level was noticeably lower. Not by much, but enough that even a novice could tell the inlet had been tampered with. That's when I realized. They weren't just trying to intimidate me. They were trying to drain the lake, to destroy the very evidence that proved the inlet's existence. And if they succeeded, I'd have nothing left to fight with. The war for Red Rock Hollow had officially begun. The morning I decided to fight back started like any other. Quiet, dusty and heavy with the scent of rain that never came. The storm clouds had gathered over Red Rock Hollow for 2 days, but the downpour refused to fall. It was as if the sky was holding its breath, waiting to see who would make the next move. I was done waiting. After the night I caught those voices near the inlet, I spent every waking hour gathering proof. Drones, cameras, timestamps, soil samples. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd play smart. My lawyer, Mark, said we'd need something indisputable, evidence no one could twist in court. So I focused on one thing, catching them in the act. That chance came sooner than I thought. Late one Thursday evening, while reviewing footage from my drone, I noticed headlights flicker near the inlet's maintenance trail. I zoomed in. 2 trucks, same model, same color as the ones I'd seen surveying weeks ago. I launched the drone again, this time live. Through the infrared feed, I saw 3 people working under portable lights, pulling equipment from the bed of the truck. One of them, short blonde hair, tailored jacket, was unmistakable. Heather. I watched her point toward the valve, shouting something I couldn't hear. The men began dismantling the pipeline coupler, the one the county still hadn't inspected. They weren't maintaining. They were rerouting. My hands shook. I wasn't scared. I was furious. I called the sheriff's office. For once, they didn't brush me off. I guess the word tampering with county water infrastructure caught their attention. They told me to stay on the line, stay safe, and record everything. but I couldn't just stay put. I drove down the gravel road with my headlights off, the drone feed glowing on my phone. As I reached the ridge above the inlet, I saw them more clearly. Flashlights bobbing, tools clanking, the hiss of pressurized water escaping. One of the men turned, startled by the sound of my truck, and yelled something. The others froze. Then Heather looked up. Even from 20 yards away, I could see the shock in her eyes twist into anger. She shouted something at her crew, then stormed toward me, her voice cutting through the wind. "You're trespassing!" she yelled. "This is HOA jurisdiction." The sheer audacity almost made me laugh. I stepped out, camera still rolling, and pointed it at the ground where they'd exposed the inlet pipe. "You just committed felony property damage, Heather." "That's my jurisdiction," she lunged for the camera. "Turn that off." That's when the sheriff's cruisers appeared, 2 of them, lights strobing red and blue against the wet dirt. The look on her face froze. The deputies got out, one hand resting casually on his holster. "Ma'am, step away from the equipment," one said. Heather tried to spin it. "We were doing emergency maintenance for the safety of the neighborhood." But the deputy wasn't buying it. On private land at midnight without a permit. She hesitated. That was all it took. They read her rights before the words even left her mouth. Her contractors tried to backtrack, claiming they were just following orders, but the sheriff had already seen enough. When they found the forged work order in her truck, stamped with a fake county seal, it was over. They cuffed her right there by the lake. The next morning, half the neighborhood was buzzing. Some came to gawk, others to apologize for not believing me. By noon, the county had issued an emergency injunction against the HOA pending investigation. Turns out, Heather had been diverting HOA funds to pay off contractors, filing bogus maintenance reports, and forging county signatures. All to fast-track the pier project before fiscal deadlines expired. It was greed dressed up as community service. Mark handled the legal cleanup, and though it dragged on for months, the outcome was clear. I kept my land, the inlet, and the lake rights. Heather lost everything, her title, her reputation, and her freedom. The HOA replaced her with new leadership, folks who actually wanted peace, not power. As for me, I stayed. Every morning, I still walked the fence line, coffee in hand, feeling the ground beneath my boots. The air smells cleaner now, the silence different, less heavy. Sometimes I stop by the lake and look at the reflection of my grandfather's old cabin in the water, thinking about how close I came to losing it all. Red Rock Hollow was never just land. It was legacy. It was proof that no matter how deep corruption runs, truth finds its way to the surface, like water forced through stone. They tried to take it from me. They underestimated how far I'd go to protect it, and every time I see that inlet glimmer in the sun, I remember, you don't just defend what's yours. You make sure no one ever dares to steal it again.